The shepherd and his flock. Sunlight, fractured by the stained glass artistry of Arcadia's First Baptist, painted the congregation in shifting colors as David Harding preached. His baritone, a well-honed instrument, filled the sanctuary. Each cadence, each carefully sculpted phrase, aimed to ignite the spiritual core of his listeners. Today, he expounded on forgiveness, the endless grace of the divine, his hands carving graceful shapes in the air, as if giving form to piety itself. Sarah watched from the front pew, a gentle smile playing on her lips. This performance was familiar, the subtle bunching of skin around his eyes when speaking of divine love, the barely perceptible tremor when narrating tales of moral rescue. Years ago, this display had captivated her, and most Sundays, a flicker of that initial devotion still sparked within her. After the benediction, the Hardings greeted the departing flock. David, a natural with people, pressed hands, offered comforting words, and recalled names, birthdays, and ailments with unnerving accuracy. He was their guide, leading them through life's wilderness, offering solace and direction in a world adrift. Beside him, Sarah embodied the supportive spouse, her smile radiating warmth, her touch feather-light as she murmured condolences to a bereft widow or praised a girl's new frock. Their 5 children, a miniature ensemble of Harding charm, swirled around them. Caleb, the eldest, sported David's prominent chin and an already impressive knack for captivating adults. The twins, Bethany and Joshua, perpetually on the verge of mischief, pulsed with boundless energy. Abigail and Samuel, the youngest, still trailed the hem of childhood, their eyes brimming with open curiosity. Reverend Harding, a woman with a flamboyant hat, gushed, squeezing his hand. That message was heaven sent. You truly have a gift. David lowered his head, affecting humility. The gift originates from him, sister. I am merely his instrument. As the stream of well-wishers ebbed, David placed a hand on Sarah's back, ushering his family toward their car. A fruitful morning, wouldn't you agree, dear? Indeed, she murmured, her gaze lingering on him perhaps a breath too long. She detected the faint etchings of strain around his eyes, the almost imperceptible clenching of his jaw. Intimately acquainted with his moods, she recognized the telltale signs of hidden pressure beneath the veneer of tranquility. The Harding residence, a sprawling ranch on the town's periphery, exuded an aura of success and meticulous planning. The flawlessly manicured lawn, the vibrant flower beds, and the flawlessly white paint whispered of order and prosperity. Inside, the savory scent of Sarah's pot roast, a weekly ritual, permeated the air. Released from the constraints of their Sunday finery, the children exploded into boisterous activity, their laughter echoing through the house. David observed them, his expression enigmatic, as Sarah managed the joyful chaos with practiced grace, directing them to wash up and lay the table. "David, would you carve a roast?" she requested, her tone gentle yet firm. He nodded, assuming his place at the head of the table, his movements precise and economical. He surveyed his family, his congregation, bathed in the chandelier's soft light. Caleb, all confident smiles, Bethany and Joshua, engaging in playful squabbles, Abigail, tracing invisible patterns on the tablecloth, and Samuel, his gaze riveted on David with unwavering adoration. "Caleb, say grace," David instructed, a subtle edge sharpening his tone. Eager to please, Caleb bowed his head and intoned the familiar invocation, expressing gratitude for their blessings, their sustenance, and their family. As the prayer concluded and the clatter of cutlery filled the space, David manufactured a smile. "So," he began, his gaze sweeping across the assembled faces, "what gems of wisdom did everyone unearth in Sunday school today?" The conversation unfolded smoothly, punctuated by the children's lively anecdotes and Sarah's gentle prodding. David listened, interjecting with an occasional nod, a word of praise, or a mild correction. He played the part of the loving patriarch, the devoted spouse, but a disquieting notion gnawed at him from within. Later, After the children were scrubbed and tucked away, and Sarah hummed softly as she tidied the remnants of the meal, David sought refuge in his study. A sanctuary of sorts, the room was lined with towering shelves of books and imbued with the comforting aroma of leather and aged paper. He poured a measure of bourbon, the amber liquid swirling in the glass as he gazed out at the gathering dusk. The seed of doubt, a pernicious weed, had been sown months prior, during a chance encounter with a visiting genealogist. He'd been researching his lineage, a pursuit he'd hoped would finally garner his father's approval. His father, an austere and unforgiving man, had always held David to impossible standards, relentlessly highlighting his perceived inadequacies. The genealogist casually mentioned advancements in DNA testing, the ability to pinpoint ancestry with remarkable precision. The idea, initially dismissed as inconsequential, had slowly burrowed its way into David's consciousness. He had been haunted by images of his father's disappointed countenance, his constant accusations that David was a weakling, a failure. He swirled the bourbon again, the ice cubes tinkling against the glass. His gaze settled on a framed photograph on his desk, a snapshot of Sarah cradling a newborn Caleb. Caleb, his firstborn, the apple of his eye. But as he studied the image, a shadow of suspicion darkened his thoughts. He knew Sarah had been involved with his father before she became his wife. Caleb had his own jawline, but it was his father's jawline as well. He slammed the glass onto the desk, the sound a jarring intrusion in the silent room. He had pushed it aside before, the persistent feeling that something was amiss. He had attempted to ignore it, to bury it beneath layers of faith and self-denial. But it persisted, resurfacing with greater force each time, fueled by his own insecurities and the echoes of his father's disparaging pronouncements. He thought of Bethany and Joshua. He thought of Abigail and Samuel. He saw his father's features in each of them, too. He lifted the glass again, his hand exhibiting a slight tremor. The bourbon burned as it slid down his throat, offering scant relief from the mounting panic. He felt cornered, suffocated by the burden of his own deceptions, his painstakingly constructed public image. He had predicated his life on faith, on family, on the unwavering conviction in his own moral uprightness. But what if it was all a fabrication? What if the very bedrock of his existence rested on shifting sands? He closed his eyes. The images of his children's faces burned into his mind. His children, were they truly his? Or were they a perpetual, living testament to his own perceived inferiority, a monument to his father's enduring influence? The notion was intolerable, a corrosive poison flowing through his veins. He would not succumb to weakness. He would not accept failure. He needed to know the truth. And whatever the price, he would safeguard his flock, even if it entailed dismantling everything he had so carefully erected. Whispers of doubt. The glow of the laptop screen painted David's face in an eerie light. He scrolled through websites promising discreet DNA testing, each click echoing in the otherwise silent study. Words like paternity, accuracy, and confidentiality jumped out, each a tiny hammer blow against the already fragile structure of his peace. He imagined Sarah asleep upstairs, her breathing rhythmic and trusting, a sound that suddenly felt like an accusation. He finally settled on a site with a minimalist design and promises of anonymity. The price was exorbitant, but David didn't flinch. Peace of mind, or at least the illusion of it, was worth any sum. He clicked through the ordering process, creating a fictitious account under the name Mr. Davis, a pathetic attempt at subterfuge that still managed to prickle his conscience. The package arrived 3 days later, a plain, unmarked envelope that he snatched from the mailbox before Sarah could retrieve the mail. Inside were 6 sterile swabs, each nestled in a small plastic tube, along with instructions as clinical and cold as a surgeon's instruments. David felt a tremor in his hands as he read them. This was it, the point of no return. That evening, after dinner, when the children were scattered throughout the house, lost in their own worlds, David began his clandestine operation. He started with Emily, his eldest. She was upstairs in her room, headphones blasting pop music, oblivious to his presence as he slipped in. "Hey, Em," he said, forcing a casual tone. "Just wanted to see how that history project is coming along." Emily peeled off her headphones, her brow furrowed with teenage annoyance. "It's fine, Dad. Almost done." "Great, great," David said, his eyes darting around the room. "Say, you know that genetics unit you did in science last year? Reminded me, your mother and I were just talking about medical history. Any allergies we should know about?" He rambled, improvising, his heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird. He held out the swab. "Just a quick cheek swab. Super easy. Helps us update the family medical records." Emily eyed him suspiciously. "Seriously, Dad? Now? I'm kind of busy." "It'll just take a second, sweetheart. Please? For your old man." He plastered on his most winning smile, the one he usually reserved for particularly stubborn parishioners. She sighed, relenting. "Fine. But make it quick." David swallowed, his mouth suddenly dry. He gently rubbed the swab against the inside of her cheek, trying to ignore the feeling of profound violation that washed over him. It felt like stealing, like a betrayal of the trust she placed in him. He repeated the process with each of his other children, each encounter a variation on the same theme of awkwardness and deceit. With Thomas, the youngest, he pretended it was a game, a secret agent mission to collect important clues. With Daniel, the sports-obsessed middle child, he mumbled something about checking for athletic genes. Only with Anna, his sharp-eyed, observant daughter, did he feel truly exposed. She looked at him with an unreadable expression, a flicker of something that might have been suspicion in her gaze. By the time he'd finished, David felt drained, depleted. The swabs, each bearing a tiny piece of his children's genetic code, lay on the desk like incriminating evidence. He carefully packaged them according to the instructions, sealing the envelope with trembling hands. Days turned into weeks. David found himself increasingly withdrawn, his sermons lacking their usual fire. He couldn't sleep, haunted by the faces of his children, by the thought of what he might discover. He jumped at every phone call, every email notification, his anxiety a constant, gnawing presence. Sarah noticed his change in demeanor. "David, what's wrong? You seem distant." He forced a smile. "Just tired, honey. The church, you know how it is. Always something." But she didn't look convinced. Her eyes, usually so full of warmth and love, now held a hint of worry, a question he desperately hoped she wouldn't voice. One afternoon, as he was preparing for a visit to a parishioner in the hospital, an email arrived. The subject line was simple: DNA test results. David froze, his heart seizing in his chest. He stared at the screen, unable to click. The cursor blinked mockingly, an insistent reminder of the Pandora's box he was about to open. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and clicked. The unholy truth. The envelope possessed an unnatural heft, burdened by the weight of its contents. The stark white glared under the study's meager light, a painful contrast to the roiling disquiet within David. His hands, usually a picture of composure during sermons, betrayed a slight tremor as he used the letter opener. He extracted the documents, their crispness whispering like skeletal leaves in a desolate graveyard. 5 reports, 1 per child. He balked, a sudden wave of sickness threatening to overwhelm him. Incineration, submersion, anything would have been preferable to this confrontation. But a morbid compulsion, a persistent, nagging doubt, held him captive. Sarah was first. The report presented its findings in neat columns of percentages and impenetrable jargon. He hunted for the damning phrase, the one he'd obsessively Googled: probability of paternity. A sharp intake of breath. 99%. He rationalized. Confirmation, what he had anticipated. Even a strange sense of relief. Yet, an icy dread began to congeal in his gut. Next, Michael. Again, the stark declaration, 99%. Tiny beads of sweat dotted his brow. 2 confirmed, 3 remaining. He recited justifications, clinging to the notion that the tests weren't gospel. His hand reached for Emily's report, his vision swimming slightly. 99%. The chair screeched back as he bolted upright. He staggered to the window, wrenching aside the heavy velvet. Outside, the inky night echoed the void that had opened inside. The air felt scarce, suffocating. He gasped, battling his runaway pulse. He couldn't draw breath. His grip tightened on the windowsill, knuckles bone-white. Impossible. A grotesque error. Some twisted prank orchestrated by lab technicians, gleefully aware of the havoc they'd unleash. Forcing himself, he returned to the desk, legs leaden and unsteady. He seized Daniel's report, his youngest, the child with his mother's eyes. A silent, desperate prayer escaped his lips as he scanned. 99%. His fist slammed down, the sound amplified in the silent house. The lamp flickered, casting monstrous shadows. A raw, untamed rage surged, eclipsing his fear. The audacity, the deceit, the betrayal. Only Abigail remained. He stared at the final, unopened report, his hand hovering. He already knew. A bone-deep certainty, chilling in its conviction. The ritual was unnecessary. He knew the obscene truth. He tore it open regardless. 99%. The room swam. The floorboards pitched beneath him. He felt himself plummeting, spiraling into disbelief and despair. He collapsed back into the chair, the reports scattered like fallen leaves, each a stark emblem of his disgrace. His father. It all coalesced now. The veiled jabs, the patronizing smiles, those subtle reminders of David's shortcomings. It wasn't merely criticism. It was a perverted claim, a silent stake driven into David's life, his wife, his progeny. A claim now ratified, undeniably proven. He recalled the way his father had always regarded Mary, a lingering gaze he'd always dismissed as paternal fondness. Now understanding dawned. It was covetousness cloaked in piety, a predator eyeing its prize. He pictured his sermons, the fiery pronouncements from the pulpit, the denunciation of sin and infidelity. He was a fraud, a charlatan, spewing empty pronouncements while his own existence mocked everything he preached. A searing shame, a profound and visceral humiliation, clawed at him. He had been living a fabrication, a carefully constructed edifice built on a foundation of lies. And now, reality had shattered the illusion, demolishing everything he'd held as true about himself, his family, his very being. He fixated on the documents, the numbers blurring. 99%. It was no mere statistic, it was a decree, a life term in a self-made prison. He began to laugh, a broken, hollow sound that reverberated through the empty house. It began as a stifled chuckle, then erupted into a hysterical sob, a purging of years of bottled fury, frustration, and despair. He was undone. His life was a barren wasteland, and it all stemmed from his father's doing. Shadows of the past, pipe smoke, and simmering censure formed the atmosphere in the study. David, a boy of 8, was a small figure dwarfed by the vast leather chair, facing his father. Samuel Harding, a figure of implacable severity, a man whose very presence radiated disapproval, stood like a monument. Sunlight, filtered through a stained glass Moses, painted fractured hues across Samuel's already austere countenance. Such levity has no place in scriptural interpretation, David. Samuel's voice, a deep resonance, filled the space. He held the boys' Sunday school essay, a crumpled indictment, in his large hand. You treat sacred words as trivial verse. Heat flared in David's cheeks. He had attempted to articulate his vision, a God of mercy, not merely divine retribution. The explanation, however, constricted in his throat, a familiar consequence of his perceived inadequacy. He was forever performing for an audience of one, striving for a standard forever beyond his reach. I only meant, he began, his voice nearly lost. Samuel dismissed him with a flick of his wrist. Original thought eludes you, David. Obedience does not. Learn to follow, and you may, in time, merit leadership. The words, a scorching brand, seared into David's awareness. He averted his gaze to the intricate patterns of the Persian rug, the colors dissolving behind the prickle of suppressed tears. Merit. A cold certainty settled within him. He never would. That memory faded, supplanted by another. David, now 12, stood hesitant in the church office doorway, holding a precarious teacup. He had been dispatched for more of his father's coffee. Through the narrow opening, he saw Samuel leaned over his desk, his voice a smooth threat aimed at Mrs. Abernathy, the church organist. Your idiosyncratic arrangement of Amazing Grace last Sunday proved distracting, Mildred. Samuel's smile was a mere contraction of his lips. A simpler score might be preferable, something less demonstrative. Mrs. Abernathy, renowned for her spirited nature and vibrant red hair, seemed to deflate under his scrutiny. David watched, transfixed, as her customary verve ebbed, leaving her pallid and subdued. He noticed the slight tremor in her hands as she accepted the revised music. Later, on their walk home, David ventured, "Why did you speak to Mrs. Abernathy like that?" "She was only trying to make the music beautiful." Samuel halted, his grip tightening on David's shoulder, a subtle expression of control. "Beauty is subjective, David. Order is immutable. It is my responsibility to maintain the church's dignity. People require direction. Without a strong hand, they wander." A shiver tracked its way down David's spine. It transcended music. It was about domination. His father demanded control over all things, all people. But the defining moment, the one that still echoed within the sterile white room where David now sat, awaiting the verdict of the DNA test, occurred when he was 16. He had finally summoned the resolve to share his burgeoning interest in theology with his father, his aspiration to emulate him. He'd envisioned, perhaps naively, a rare moment of paternal approval. He discovered his father in the rose garden, meticulously engaged in pruning, his movements precise, bordering on violent. David cleared his throat. "Father, I've been considering my future." Samuel snipped a thorny cane. "Indeed? What ambitious schemes have you conceived?" I think I want to become a pastor." David's heart hammered against his ribs. Samuel's eyes narrowed to slits. He turned, the pruning shears catching the afternoon light with a dangerous glint. "A pastor? You, David? You lack the fortitude, the necessary resilience. You are too pliant." David's world lurched. The carefully cultivated self-image, the one he hoped would finally earn his father's favor, disintegrated. "But I've been immersed in Scripture," he protested, his voice wavering. "I feel a sense of calling." Samuel emitted a harsh, brittle laugh. "Calling? You crave validation, David. A desire to embody something you're not. The ministry demands unwavering strength, an iron will, qualities you manifestly lack." He paused, his gaze like a physical blow. "Furthermore," he continued, his voice dropping to a confidential murmur, "the Harding lineage carries a certain weight. It requires a specific type of individual, one who commands deference, one who grasps the nature of power." He returned to the roses, leaving David isolated and deflated, the weight of his father's disillusionment crushing him. That day, David didn't merely abandon a dream. He shed a piece of himself. He learned to conceal his vulnerabilities, to project an exterior of unwavering strength, to mirror the very man he held in contempt. He mastered the art of becoming what his father expected, even at the expense of his own identity. Now, decades later, the truth had detonated, shattering the carefully constructed facade, exposing the moral decay concealed within. His father hadn't simply thwarted his ambitions. He had appropriated his life. The DNA results transcended betrayal. They affirmed his deepest fear, that he was no more than a marionette, manipulated by a man who had never displayed genuine affection. The shadows of his past had risen to engulf him. Confrontation. David hurled the report onto the polished mahogany. The sharp thud shattered the tense quiet, a jarring note against the measured pulse of the grandfather clock in the hall. Sarah's knitting needles stilled. She raised her gaze, a crease forming between her brows. "What's this, David?" she inquired, her tone even, almost unnaturally so. He remained mute, his gaze fixed on the document. His knuckles gleamed, bone-white against the chair back he clutched. The very air seemed to congeal, thick with unspoken accusations. At last, words escaped him, a gravelly croak. The DNA analysis. The one you submitted. Remember its purpose? The click of her needles resumed, then ceased as she set aside her work. Of course. What does it reveal? He shoved the report across the table. The paper hissed softly against the wood's slick surface. Her eyes darted across the page, and her complexion paled. David, I don't understand the implications. Don't understand? His voice detonated, rising an octave. Don't feign ignorance, Sarah. The truth is right there, etched in clinical terms. Our children, they're not biologically related to me. The declaration hung, a poison barb. Sarah flinched, as if physically struck. That's impossible. How can you even suggest such a thing? Impossibility refuted by science, Sarah. They share a familial bond, a closer one, with Samuel, my progenitor. The last two words were expelled like venom. Her eyes widened, reflecting a burgeoning horror. You can't be serious, David. This has to be an error. Serious? Never more so. Did you imagine this could remain buried forever? That I wouldn't unearth the truth? He began to prowl, his agitation amplified with each step, the floorboards groaning beneath his weight. The pervasive fragrance of lilies from the mantelpiece now felt stifling, like a shroud. David, please listen, she implored, her voice trembling like a leaf. You're drawing conclusions without basis. There must be a rational explanation. An explanation? 5 children, Sarah, all genetically skewed towards my father? What explanation suffices for that? He pivoted, his gaze burning into her. Were you intimate with him? Was I an oblivious fool all these years? Sarah gasped, her hand flying to cover her mouth. How dare you, to even entertain such a vile thought? I've been devoted to you for 3 decades. Devoted? Is it your term for it? Living a lie, fostering children with a lineage unknown to me? I've dedicated my existence to this family, to this calling, and you desecrate it with this betrayal. I haven't betrayed you, David. Your judgment is clouded. She rose, her own anger beginning to simmer. Samuel, he was a master of manipulation, a man of cruelty. You know this. Where are you going with this accusation? He demanded, his tone laced with danger. He sought power over everything, over everyone involved. He made my existence a torturous cycle. Her gaze dropped, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. He saw the depth of my affection for you, the joy we shared. He couldn't bear it. David scrutinized her, his features twisted with confusion and disbelief. Are you suggesting coercion? That he forced himself upon you? Sarah's silence was a thunderous affirmation. The air thrummed with suppressed suffering, with the burden of years of obscured truths. He threatened to dismantle you, David, to obliterate your career, your integrity. He asserted he would expose you as weak, unfit for the pulpit, echoing the judgment he continually cast upon you. He was aware of your profound desire for his approval. Her voice was barely audible. He declared that he would disseminate the truth, that you weren't even his blood. David recoiled, clutching his chest. The room swam before him. He felt engulfed, her words a crushing weight. He revealed this to you. Yes, she choked out. Ages ago, he confessed that you weren't his progeny, that he had conspired to ensure your mother conceived with another, someone else, someone he considered worthy, someone strong. A wave of sickness crested over David. He collapsed into a chair, his frame trembling uncontrollably. The revelations crashed down, demolishing the meticulously constructed edifice of his life. The years of inadequacy, of striving for Samuel's validation, of perpetually falling short, it coalesced into a horrifying clarity. His life had been a fabrication, he a mere pawn in Samuel's sinister game. And you withheld this from me? He whispered, his voice raw with anguish. I was paralyzed by fear, David, fear of his reprisals, fear of the devastation it would inflict upon you. His influence was absolute, encompassing all of us. Tears coursed down her cheeks. I believe I was safeguarding you, protecting our family unit. Safeguarding me, he bellowed, his rage reigniting. By perpetuating this charade, by permitting me to nurture children under the delusion that they were mine, when all along, the words failed him. The wound was too fresh, too profound. He surged to his feet, sending the chair crashing to the floor. I must escape this place, he uttered, his voice trembling. I require solitude for reflection. He wheeled and bolted from the room, abandoning Sarah amidst the ruins of their shattered world. The rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock echoed, a mocking metronome counting the seconds of his irrevocably broken reality. A moment of darkness. The air in the study vibrated with the fallout of Sarah's words, a palpable tension that tightened around David's throat. The grandfather clock, an antique sentinel in the corner, chimed with undue emphasis, each tick a hammer blow against the edifice of David's past. He felt unraveled, like a tapestry pulled apart thread by thread. He violated you? David rasped, the question a raw scrape in the silence. His meticulously ordered existence had detonated, the fragments embedding themselves deep within his spirit. Sarah recoiled, tears glistening on her lashes. David, please understand. He'd expose everything, that you weren't his blood. I believed I was shielding you. Shielding him? The phrase soured in his mouth, a bitter betrayal. She had condemned him. They all had. Samuel, with his calculated charisma and tyrannical will. Sarah, with her clandestine acts and subsequent justifications. His life had been a fabrication, a cruel jest perpetrated by those he held most dear. A glacial rage began to solidify within him, eclipsing the initial shock. It snaked around his core, constricting his lungs. Decades spent chasing an illusion of perfection, yearning for paternal acceptance, anchoring his life to faith and kin, all reduced to a ludicrous charade. Protecting me, he echoed, voice escalating. By consorting with my father? By allowing him to desecrate our vows, our family's sanctity? You call that protection? He advanced, fist clenching reflexively. Sarah flinched, stark terror blooming on her face. He saw her anew, not as his wife, his confidant, but as an accomplice in this grand deception. You were aware, he spat, the words venom-laced. For years you concealed it? You let me believe, you let me love a fiction. David, please be reasonable, Sarah implored, her voice a fragile tremor. Let me explain. Explain what, Sarah? The mechanics of your betrayal? How you willingly shared a bed with my father? How you bore his progeny? How you deliberately dismantled everything I cherished? He stalked closer, propelled by an unseen force. The years of pent-up resentment, the relentless pressure to excel, the nagging sense of worthlessness Samuel had so skillfully instilled, all surged to the surface in a tidal wave of fury. Sarah stumbled back, hand outstretched in a futile attempt to create distance. David, stop. You're frightening me. Frightening her? He craved more than fear. He wanted her to experience the agony that was tearing him asunder, the absolute devastation that had engulfed him. You deserve to be terrified, he snarled, his voice a low, guttural thrum. You've destroyed everything. He lunged, his fingers clamping around her upper arm. A sharp, piercing cry escaped her lips, fueling his incandescent rage. He tightened his grip, knuckles bone white. David, you're hurting me. He registered nothing. He saw nothing. He was submerged in a blinding maelstrom of fury and disillusionment. He shook her, demanding explanations, demanding some semblance of reason to mitigate the horror she had unleashed. Why, Sarah? Why did you subject us to this? Her head whipped back and forth, her eyes wide with unadulterated panic. I told you, he threatened. He shook her again, with brutal force this time. Her head lolled violently, and her body went pliant. He released his hold, suddenly cognizant of the unnatural stillness that had overtaken her. Sarah crumpled to the floor, a broken figure at his feet. Her eyes remained open, fixed blankly on the ceiling, reflecting nothing. A scarlet thread trickled from the corner of her mouth. David stared, his mind refusing to assimilate the reality before him. The rage that had possessed him moments earlier receded, leaving him hollow and frigid. He knelt, his hand trembling as he reached for her cheek. "Sarah," he breathed, his voice a mere exhalation. "Sarah, please wake." He shook her gently, but there was no response. Her skin felt like ice. He pressed his ear to her chest, straining for a heartbeat, but encountered only silence. A wave of nausea threatened to overwhelm him. He had perpetrated this act. He, Reverend David Harding, the paragon of virtue, the man of God, had murdered his wife. He recoiled, his body convulsing. The enormity of his actions pressed down on him, an unbearable weight. He had forfeited everything, his faith, his kinship, his identity, and now he had forfeited his soul. The study was hushed save for the monotonous ticking of the grandfather clock, its pendulum a mocking reminder, counting down the seconds to his inevitable ruin. David gazed at his hands, stained with Sarah's lifeblood. He was imprisoned in a vortex of shadow, a desolate expanse where hope and redemption had perished. Descent into madness. The crimson stain blooming on the Persian rug pulsed like a malevolent heart, a silent, unwavering indictment. Sarah lay still, eyes wide and glazed, reflecting the dim candlelight as dull, spectral orbs. David knelt, the stiff linen of his collar a tightening noose around his throat, mirroring the suffocating guilt poised to shatter him. He had fractured, shattered beyond repair. His mind, once an ordered sanctuary of logic and faith, had become a cacophony of shrieking anxieties. He gasped for air, paralyzed, compelled to action, any action to stem the tide. He squeezed his eyes shut, conjuring the aftermath. Imprisonment, infamy, the annihilation of everything he'd constructed meticulously in God's name. He envisioned his children, faces twisted in appalled disbelief. The congregation, their murmurs escalating into a chorus of condemnation. No, unthinkable. His gaze snagged on the heavy mahogany desk in the corner, its polished surface gleaming. He lurched to his feet, legs unsteady, and stumbled toward it. In the top drawer, amongst forgotten sermon drafts and mundane office supplies, lay the hunting knife Samuel had gifted him years ago, a clumsy, misguided attempt at masculine connection. He fixed on the knife, the polished steel mirroring his own fractured visage. He recalled Samuel's gravelly voice, laced with perpetual disappointment. A man provides, David, and that means protection. Protection of his family, of his reputation, of himself. The thought, a fragile whisper, erupted into a deafening roar. He gripped the knife, the frigid steel a sharp counterpoint to the searing shame consuming him. He returned to Sarah's side, the air heavy with the coppery reek of spilled life. He knew what he was compelled to do. The subsequent hours were a plummet into a waking delirium. Details fractured into shards of sweat, gore, and the sickening crunch of bone yielding to steel. He worked with a cold detachment, his mind a blank slate, his actions robotic. The familiar contours of his wife transformed into components, disconnected fragments. Each piece was encased in heavy-duty refuse bags, procured weeks prior for a church cleanup, now repurposed for unimaginable depravity. The rug, saturated and heavy, was rolled with agonizing effort and bound with industrial tape. Every surface felt was purged with bleach, the sharp fumes stinging his sinuses. His senses were heightened, acutely aware of each floorboard's complaint, every whisper of wind through the surrounding trees. He moved on instinct, fueled by stark terror and a primal need for self-preservation. Hymns fluttered in his mind, half-remembered scripture snippets like moths drawn to a dying flame. "The Lord's my shepherd, I'll not want." The words left a bitter film on his tongue. He faltered, pressing against the wall, his body convulsing. He studied his hands, stained a ghastly red despite his desperate scrubbing. They were alien appendages now, instruments of monstrousness. He scrubbed them raw with a stiff brush and harsh soap, the skin sloughing off in ribbons. But the stain persisted, indelible, seared into his very being. As dawn bled across the horizon in hues of pale lavender and rose, he completed the task. The bags were crammed into the car's trunk, the rug a bulky sentinel among them. He was coated in grime, his clothing ripped, his face a mask of filth and dried tears. The reflection in the mirror was barely recognizable. Reverend David Harding, pillar of rectitude, voice of God, had dissolved. In his place stood a fractured shell, empty and damned. He ignited the engine, the sudden roar fracturing the morning stillness. Reversing from the driveway, he glanced back at the house, his haven, now a mausoleum. A profound emptiness consumed him. The world appeared muted, distant, as though viewed through clouded glass. He drove without direction, the nascent sun casting elongated, grotesque shadows that preceded him. Disposal was paramount, oblivion essential. He steered toward the Everglades, the vast, desolate swampland, a fitting stage for the malevolence that gripped him. Sawgrass whispered secrets on the breeze, secrets he now shared. No longer a shepherd, he was prey, driven and solitary, descending into the desolate depths, scattering the pieces. The swamp's breath, humid and stifling, wrapped around David like a shroud as he wrestled the heavy burlap sack from the trunk. Before him, the Everglades sprawled, a maze of sawgrass and brackish water offering a promise of oblivion. He'd picked this isolated spot meticulously, far from prying eyes, where reptilian watchers were more likely than human ones. The sack contained Sarah's torso, swathed in plastic. The reek was intensifying, a nauseating assault even through the layers. Bile stung David's throat. He shoved the burden towards the water, where it landed with a sodden thud in the mud. Sleep had abandoned him. Guilt and a surge of adrenaline kept him on edge, a nervous current buzzing through his limbs. Each snap of a twig, each distant rumble of traffic, echoed like the approaching clamor of justice. He pictured crimson and blue lights painting his rearview mirror, a detective's grim face demanding answers he couldn't voice. He banished the vision, forcing his focus back to the present. Dispose of the evidence. Protect the children. Maintain the fabrication. For endless hours, he'd driven, zigzagging across Florida, a grim scavenger hunt guided by desperation. He'd flung an arm from a Daytona Beach bridge into the surging Atlantic depths. A leg lay buried beneath the dense pine litter of Ocala National Forest. Each location was chosen with a twisted logic, meant to muddy the waters, to suggest multiple assailants or the random dispersal of ocean currents. Driven by manic energy, he worked with brisk haste. Sweat glued his shirt to his skin. Mosquitoes buzzed around his head, puncturing his flesh. He ignored the pests, his mind a maelstrom of fear and remorse. He conjured Sarah's smile, the delicate lines radiating from her eyes when she laughed. He recalled the comfort of her hand in his, the solace of her body beside him in the dark. These memories, once a refuge, now felt like splinters lodging in his soul. He ripped the sack open, the protesting plastic sounding like a final exhale. The contents triggered a violent retch. He pushed the remains into the black water, watching as they descended slowly, swallowed by the depths. He scoured his hands with coarse sand, desperate to obliterate the lingering feel of her skin, the tactile memory of his deed. Futile. The stain was indelible, branded onto his conscience. Back in the car, he tore off his soaked shirt and stuffed it into a trash bag already brimming with incriminating remnants. The gloves, the saw, the blood-soaked cloths. He'd jettison the collection later, far from here. He ignited the engine, his grip on the wheel tenuous due to tremors. Re-entering the highway, the sudden glare of an oncoming pickup momentarily blinded him. He tightened his hold, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He was a phantom, haunting Florida's roadways, an outcast fleeing retribution. Later that day, a young couple strolling near Daytona stumbled upon a ghastly find. The woman's scream, sharp and piercing, shattered the rhythm of the surf. Her boyfriend, a lean college student tanned by the sun, stared with morbid fascination at the object partially exposed in the sand. An arm, a woman's arm, pale and inert, with a slender gold bracelet encircling the wrist. He fumbled for his phone, his hands slick with sweat. We found something. You need to get here now." The local news seized the story almost immediately. "Body part found on Daytona Beach," headline screamed. The air crackled with conjecture. Shark attack? Boating mishap? Or something far more malevolent? Detective Miller, a seasoned veteran hardened by 2 decades on the force, arrived at the scene. He scanned the area, his gaze sweeping the beach, the dunes, the relentless ocean. He'd seen his share of grim scenes, but this possessed a disturbing quality. The surgical precision of the severance, the absence of accompanying remains, it hinted at calculation, at purpose. He knelt beside the limb, his expression grave. "Get forensics down here," he snapped at a uniformed officer, "and notify the medical examiner. I want a complete analysis. Everything." Back in his car, David listened to the radio report. He clenched the steering wheel, his knuckles bone white. The discovery. They'd located it. He swallowed, fighting the surge of panic. He needed composure. He needed to think. He checked the rearview mirror, his eyes flitting nervously. He pictured police cars closing in, their sirens a mournful cry, their lights a strobing threat. He was ensnared, caught in a web of his own weaving. He slammed on the accelerator, urging the car forward, desperate to outrun the truth, to evade the consequences. But the truth, like the dense humidity, was inescapable. It clung to him, stifled him, poisoning his thoughts. And he knew, with chilling certainty, that total consumption was only a matter of time. Unraveling the truth. The phone call came just after sunrise. Detective Maria Rodriguez, a woman built of lean muscle and quiet determination, listened intently, her gaze fixed on the swirling steam rising from her mug of Cuban coffee. "Another piece?" she asked, her voice low and gravelly. The voice on the other end confirmed it. A torso discovered near the Halifax River. "All right," Rodriguez said, sighing. "Let's get a team out there. And page CSU. Tell them to bring everything." She arrived at the Harding residence a little after 10. The house, a sprawling ranch style with meticulously manicured lawns, radiated an unsettling normalcy. As she walked up the drive, the front door swung open, revealing Reverend David Harding. He stood tall, his face etched with concern, but his eyes held a flicker of something Rodriguez couldn't quite place. "Detective," he greeted, extending a hand. His grip was firm, almost too firm. "What can I do for you?" "Reverend Harding," Rodriguez replied, returning the handshake. "We're investigating the discovery of human remains found near Daytona Beach and Halifax River. As your wife, Sarah, has been reported missing, we need to ask you some questions." David's composure faltered, just for a moment. "Of course, detective. Anything I can do to help." He ushered her inside. The air inside was thick with the scent of lilies and something metallic. Rodriguez settled into a plush armchair in the living room, her notebook open on her lap. "When was the last time you saw your wife, Reverend?" "Last Thursday," he said smoothly. "She was going to a conference in Orlando. Something about Christian education." He paused, as if searching for the right words. She was so passionate about her work. Rodriguez scribbled notes, her eyes never leaving David's face. "And you haven't heard of her since?" "No. I assumed she was busy with the conference. Sarah always got completely absorbed in her work." "Did she mention who she was traveling with?" David shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I don't recall any specific names. She knew a lot of people in that field." Rodriguez pressed on. "Did she take her car?" "No. She said she was carpooling with someone. I didn't think to ask who." The inconsistencies were subtle, almost imperceptible, but they were there. Rodriguez had learned to trust her instincts. They rarely failed her. "Reverend, can you tell me about your relationship with your wife?" David's face softened. "We were very happy, detective. Sarah was my rock, my confidant. We built a beautiful life together." But Rodriguez noticed the slight tremor in his voice, the way his eyes darted around the room, avoiding hers. Has your wife ever mentioned wanting to leave? Any marital problems? Absolutely not, he insisted, a little too vehemently. We had our disagreements, of course, but nothing serious, nothing that would cause her to run away. As Rodriguez continued her questioning, a forensics team arrived. They moved with quiet efficiency, dusting for prints, collecting samples, their presence a stark contrast to the serene facade of the house. Rodriguez watched them work, her mind piecing together the puzzle. Back at the station, the initial forensic reports painted a grim picture. Traces of blood, meticulously cleaned but not entirely eradicated, were found in the master bathroom. A hair, matching Sarah's DNA, was recovered from a drain. And, most damningly, traces of bone fragments were discovered in the backyard fire pit. The news spread like wildfire through the small town. Whispers turned to murmurs, then to outright accusations. The image of the beloved reverend, the pillar of the community, began to crumble. People who had once sought his counsel now avoided his gaze. The church, once a sanctuary, became a place of hushed speculation and uneasy glances. The most difficult part for Rodriguez was informing David's children. Their grief was raw, visceral, their confusion and disbelief palpable. They clung to the hope that their mother would return, that this was all a terrible mistake. Later that evening, Rodriguez sat alone in her office, rereading the interview transcript. David's carefully constructed narrative was riddled with holes. The inconsistencies, the evasiveness, the almost theatrical display of grief, it all pointed in one direction. She picked up the phone and dialed a number. "Get a warrant," she said to the voice on the other end, "for the Harding residence, and bring Reverend David Harding in for questioning. I think it's time we had a serious conversation." The truth, buried beneath layers of deceit and denial, was about to be unearthed. Confession and judgment. The interrogation room felt close, the hum of the fluorescent lights a grating counterpoint to the silence. Detective Rodriguez sat opposite David, the arrest warrant a stark white rectangle on the table. No raised voice, no histrionics, just an implacable stare that bored into him, seeking the truth beneath the practiced grief. "Reverend Harding," she began, her tone even, precise, "we recovered Sarah's blood throughout your house. Not incidental traces, understand. Substantial quantities. Bedroom, bathroom, garage. And the saw from your tool shed? Forensic analysis confirms it was employed to dissect bone." David remained mute, his features arranged in a tableau of bereavement. He dabbed at dry eyes with a handkerchief, projecting the image of a grieving spouse struggling against disbelief. Rodriguez remained unimpressed. "We also found evidence of bleach, Reverend. Copious amounts. Someone labored extensively to eradicate something." A pregnant pause filled the small space. "What were you eradicating, Reverend?" His practiced composure wavered. A telltale tremor flickered through his hands. His breathing shallowed. He attempted to speak, but only a dry rasp escaped. Rodriguez advanced the attack, leaning forward. "We're aware of the DNA test, David. Samuel, too. We know the intricate tapestry of falsehoods you've woven. It's time for candor." The carefully constructed facade imploded. A ragged sob tore from his throat, unleashing a flood of tears. "It was an accident," he choked, barely audible. "An accident, I swear." He narrated the quarrel, the incandescent rage ignited by Sarah's confrontation with the DNA findings, the decades of deceit laid bare. He spoke of the shove, the sickening crack as her skull met the sharp edge of the kitchen counter. He hadn't intended to kill her, he repeated, but death had been instantaneous, and panic had seized him. "I was lost," he whimpered, burying his face. "Panicked. I only wanted to protect them, my family, my standing." He confessed everything: the dismemberment, the furtive disposal, the elaborate charade of the vanished wife. His voice flattened, devoid of emotion, reciting the details as if they were a list of errands. The particulars were gruesome, stomach-churning. Rodriguez listened, a knot of revulsion tightening in her chest, mingled with the cold satisfaction of the chase concluded. The trial became a media inferno. The small Florida town was besieged, transformed into a spectacle of camera flashes and lurid headlines. The prosecution amassed an insurmountable case. The bloody evidence, the telltale saw, the damning DNA, the weight of his confession. The defense countered with a narrative of passion, a tragic accident born of simmering resentment. The courtroom overflowed daily. Spectators traveled from across the nation, hungry to witness the fall of the esteemed Reverend Harding. Revelations regarding his parentage, his bastard children, his wife's brutal end, all stoked public outrage and disgust. David sat at the defendant's table, a mere echo of his former self. His eyes held no light, his face was hollowed. He seemed detached from the proceedings, already inhabiting a separate, self-constructed reality. The jury wrestled with the evidence for 12 grueling hours before reaching consensus. As the foreman pronounced the verdict, guilty, a collective intake of breath swept through the courtroom. David betrayed no visible reaction, as though resigned to this outcome. The sentencing unfolded with swift, unforgiving finality. The judge, his voice devoid of warmth, condemned David to life imprisonment, without possibility of parole. As bailiffs escorted him away, his gaze swept over the gallery, as if searching for a friendly face, a sign of forgiveness. He found only anger, aversion, and pity. In those final moments of freedom, before the iron gates of the prison clanged shut, David experienced a profound desolation. He had forfeited everything: his wife, his children, his faith, his name, his liberty. Utterly and irrevocably alone, he was left with only the crushing weight of his culpability and the inescapable ramifications of his choices. The Harding family tragedy cast a long shadow over the community, a pall that lingered long after the legal proceedings concluded. The church, once a beacon of community and comfort, stood vacant, a stark monument to the corrosive nature of secrets and the destructive force of uncontrolled rage. The meticulously constructed edifice of respectability had collapsed, exposing the rot beneath. All that remained was a wasteland of shattered lives and extinguished dreams. The Hardings had become a cautionary fable, a grim reminder that truth, however agonizing, invariably surfaces, and that the consequences of deception can be immeasurably ruinous.